My husband's family tried to destroy my career, but I used their own game to expose them all. I'm still reeling from everything that's happened, and I don't even know where to begin, so I'll just start from the beginning. My husband, Mark, and I have been married for 5 years, together for 7. We met in college. I was studying business and finance, and he was in pre-med. We both came from very different backgrounds. I grew up in a middle-class family. My parents were both teachers, and they instilled in me a strong work ethic and a belief in meritocracy. Mark, on the other hand, came from old money. His family owns a highly successful, multi-generational pharmaceutical company. His father, Richard, is the CEO, and his mother, Eleanor, is on the board of directors. His older brother, Robert, is the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take over the company. Then there's Sarah, his older sister, who dabbles in various charities and enjoys the socialite life. When Mark and I started dating, I was initially intimidated by his family. Their estate was sprawling, their dinners formal, and their conversations often revolved around business deals and social connections I knew nothing about. But Mark was different. He was grounded, kind, and genuinely interested in my life and aspirations. He never made me feel inferior, and he always defended me against his family's subtle snobbery. His dream, unlike his brothers, was not to join the family business but to become a pediatrician. He wanted to help people directly, a sentiment I admired deeply. After we graduated, I landed a job at a prestigious investment bank. It was demanding, but I thrived on the challenge. Mark was in medical school, and we supported each other through the grueling hours and stress. When we decided to get married, his family was, predictably, less than thrilled. Eleanor made a few veiled comments about me not being prepared for the responsibilities of being a Hayes, and Richard questioned my career choice, suggesting it wasn't ladylike enough for a wife in their family. Mark, bless his heart, shut them down every time, making it clear that I was his choice and my career was my own. The first few years of our marriage were a blur of professional growth for me and intense studying for Mark. I was quickly moving up the ranks at the bank, pulling in significant deals and earning a reputation for being sharp and tenacious. Mark finished medical school and started his residency, working long, exhausting shifts but loving every minute of it. We managed to carve out a wonderful life for ourselves, balancing our demanding careers with our relationship. We bought a modest but beautiful house, went on adventurous vacations, and built a strong network of friends. The problems with Mark's family, however, started to escalate as my career gained more traction. It began subtly. At family gatherings, conversations would often steer towards my work, but not in a congratulatory way. Instead, Eleanor would make comments about how much I must be neglecting my husband or how my job sounded stressful for a young woman. Sarah would always ask about my future plans with a knowing smirk, implying that my career was a temporary hobby before I settled into a more appropriate role as a Hayes wife. Robert, the most overtly dismissive, would often interrupt me when I spoke about my work, redirecting the conversation to his own successes at the family company. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to their old-fashioned views. Mark was always my biggest supporter, and that's what truly mattered. But then things took a more sinister turn. About 2 years ago, I was offered a significant promotion at the bank, which would put me on the partner track. It was a huge deal, a culmination of years of hard work and dedication. I was ecstatic, and Mark was incredibly proud. We decided to celebrate the news with his family, hoping they would finally see my achievements as something to be admired. Big mistake. At dinner, when I announced my promotion, there was an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Richard gave a tight-lipped smile, Eleanor cleared her throat loudly, and Sarah's eyes narrowed. Robert, however, was the most vocal. He scoffed. "Another promotion? Isn't it time you considered a less demanding role? My name?" A Hayes wife usually focuses on family and supporting her husband's endeavors, not trying to outshine everyone. I was floored. Mark immediately jumped to my defense, but the damage was done. I tried to explain that my career was important to me, that it was about more than just money, but about intellectual fulfillment and making a tangible impact. Eleanor then chimed in, "Darling, we just want what's best for Mark. A wife who is constantly at the office might not be able to provide him with the home life he deserves. You know, a healthy family environment." That night, Mark and I had a long talk. He was furious with his family, especially Robert. He assured me that he loved my ambition and was incredibly proud of me. But he also admitted that his family's constant pressure was getting to him, especially the subtle jabs about me not being good enough for him. I told him I wouldn't let them dictate my life or career. Over the next few months, their tactics became more aggressive. I started receiving anonymous emails at my work address, filled with vague accusations of unethical behavior, implying I was cutting corners or using insider information. They were clearly designed to sow doubt and create problems for me professionally. I initially dismissed them as disgruntled colleagues or random trolls, but the timing always seemed to coincide with a family gathering where my career was discussed. Then came the phone calls. My office started receiving calls from concerned citizens asking about my work ethic and commitment. My superiors, thankfully, knew me well and saw through it, but it was incredibly unsettling. I confided in Mark, and he was livid. He confronted his family, accusing them of trying to sabotage my career. They, of course, denied everything, feigning shock and concern. Eleanor even shed a few crocodile tears, claiming she was worried about my stress levels and that someone must be targeting me because of my high-profile job. It became clear to me then that this wasn't just passive-aggressive behavior, it was an active campaign to undermine me. I realized that my success threatened their carefully constructed world where the Hayes men were powerful and their wives were decorative adjuncts. My independent career and financial success challenged their patriarchal worldview and, perhaps more importantly, outshone Robert, who was constantly being compared to me by mutual acquaintances outside their immediate circle. The final straw came when I was working on a major merger deal, one that would significantly boost my standing at the firm. The stakes were incredibly high, and I was putting in 18-hour days. One evening, after a particularly late night at the office, I came home to find a strange package on our doorstep. It was a pristine, white baby romper, embroidered with the words Future Hayes Heir. Inside was a card that read, "It's time to prioritize what truly matters, my name. Some things are more important than a corner office." I showed it to Mark, and he looked absolutely disgusted. "That's it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They've gone too far." He recognized his mother's handwriting on the card. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to fight back. I knew I couldn't accuse them without concrete proof, and their tactics were designed to be deniable. So, I decided to play their game, but with my own rules. I had an advantage. I understood finance, strategy, and corporate power dynamics better than they gave me credit for. My plan was multifaceted. First, I started documenting everything. Every snide comment, every suspicious email, every strange phone call. I created a detailed timeline, noting dates, times, and specific remarks. I also started recording family conversations on my phone, discreetly, during gatherings. It felt wrong, but I knew I needed irrefutable evidence. Second, I decided to cultivate a public image of vulnerability and exhaustion. At family events, I started acting increasingly stressed, dropping subtle hints about the demands of my job and how I was struggling to cope. I even started dressing a bit more conservatively, less like a sharp executive and more like someone on the verge of burnout. I wanted them to believe their plan was working, to make them overconfident and sloppy. Third, and most crucial, I began to subtly research the Hayes family's pharmaceutical company. I had access to powerful databases and analytical tools at my bank. I wasn't looking for anything illegal, just anything that could be leveraged. I focused on their public filings, their competitive landscape, and their key market positions. I paid particular attention to their competitors and any recent regulatory changes that might impact their business. What I found was interesting. A few of their older, highly profitable drugs were facing patent expiration in the next 18 to 24 months, and their pipeline for new, equally lucrative drugs seemed surprisingly thin. They were heavily reliant on these expiring patents. This gave me an idea. The Hayes Company had always projected an image of unshakable stability and market dominance. But underneath, there were vulnerabilities, especially regarding their future revenue streams. I also noticed that Robert, while outwardly confident, often made impulsive decisions and seemed more interested in public perception than rigorous strategic planning. He frequently boasted about innovative new partnerships and groundbreaking research without providing much detail. My fourth step was to use my own professional network. I subtly floated the idea to a few trusted colleagues and contacts in the financial journalism world that I was concerned about the stability of certain long-established pharmaceutical companies, without naming the Hayes Company directly. I spoke about the challenges of patent cliffs and the importance of a robust drug pipeline. I knew these seeds would eventually grow. The Hayes family, seeing my manufactured vulnerability, became bolder. Eleanor started sending me articles about women who chose family over career and how they found true happiness. Robert, emboldened, began openly bad-mouthing my firm and my industry at family dinners, implying it was a house of cards. He even started making thinly veiled threats about people with powerful connections who could make life difficult for those who crossed them. I recorded every single one of these interactions. Then came the grand finale, the annual Hays Family Charity Gala. It was the social event of the year, a black tie affair attended by influential figures, investors, and prominent members of the community. I knew this was my stage. A week before the gala, I confided in Sarah, tearfully telling her how overwhelmed I was feeling and how I was even considering taking a sabbatical from work. I exaggerated my stress and burnout, knowing she would immediately relay this to Eleanor and Robert. I wanted them to believe they had won, to drop their guard completely. On the night of the gala, I arrived with Mark, looking impeccably dressed but with a carefully constructed air of exhaustion. Eleanor immediately cornered me, radiating a smug satisfaction. "Darling, I'm so glad to hear you're finally coming to your senses about your career," she purred. "It's so much more fulfilling to focus on your home life and support your husband." Robert, nearby, overheard and added, "Indeed. Some careers are just too volatile for a family woman. It's best to know when to step aside." I just offered a weak smile and said, "Perhaps you're right, Robert. It's a tough world out there." Later in the evening, as people mingled and the champagne flowed, Robert took to the stage to give a speech about the future of the Hays Pharmaceutical Company. He spoke with his usual bombast, boasting about their unparalleled market position, their innovative research, and their secure future. He made several vague but confident claims about upcoming breakthroughs and expansion into new markets, all designed to project an image of impregnable strength. As he spoke, I caught Eleanor's eye, and she gave me a small, triumphant nod, clearly thinking her plan had succeeded in pushing me out. This was my cue that I had arranged for a short, carefully worded leak to be published on a prominent financial news website during the gala. The leak wasn't about the Hays family specifically, but rather a speculative piece discussing the challenges faced by pharmaceutical companies heavily reliant on expiring patents, with a subtle emphasis on specific drug classes that were coincidentally a major part of the Hays company's portfolio. It also highlighted the importance of a transparent and robust pipeline for future growth. The article was timed to go live exactly when Robert was making his speech. As Robert was wrapping up his speech, phones around the room started to subtly buzz. People, including some key investors and board members, began checking their devices. I watched as their faces shifted from polite attention to confusion, then to concern, as they read the news. The article, while not directly naming the Hays Company, presented a scenario that perfectly mirrored their current vulnerabilities. It was a well-known secret within the industry that the Hays Company was facing patent cliffs, but Robert's overly confident, almost arrogant speech had made them particularly susceptible to this kind of counter-narrative. The contrast between his grand pronouncements and the article's stark reality created a ripple of unease. Then, as Robert stepped down from the podium, I made my move. I walked over to a small group of influential board members and major investors who were discussing the article, looking genuinely troubled. I approached them with a concerned expression, carrying a printout of the article I had subtly prepared. "Excuse me," I said, my voice soft but clear. "I couldn't help but notice everyone is discussing this article. It's quite concerning, isn't it? Especially after Robert's speech." One of the board members, Mr. Davies, a notoriously shrewd investor, looked at me, surprised. "Indeed, my name. A bit contradictory, wouldn't you say?" "Yes," I replied, lowering my voice slightly, "and I've been doing some independent analysis, given my background in finance. While I don't have access to proprietary information, my market research suggests that the Hays Company's reliance on their existing patent portfolio is far riskier than they publicly admit. Their pipeline, from what I can discern from publicly available data, doesn't appear to be as robust as Robert just claimed. It leaves them incredibly exposed to market fluctuations and competition, especially with those upcoming patent expirations." I then pulled out a few graphs I had meticulously prepared, disguised as personal notes from my stressful work, showing projected revenue decline based on publicly available data and industry trends. I highlighted how other pharmaceutical companies with similar profiles were actively diversifying and investing heavily in new research, something the Hays Company, under Robert's recent direction, seemed to be neglecting. The investors and board members, who had always seen me as Mark's wife rather than a financial expert, were visibly taken aback. They started asking me specific questions, and I answered them with precision and confidence, citing market trends, regulatory landscapes, and financial projections. I didn't accuse Robert directly. I simply presented a compelling, data-driven counter-narrative that directly contradicted his optimistic, but ultimately hollow, speech. As I spoke, I saw Richard and Eleanor across the room, their faces slowly draining of color as they watched the investors listening intently to me. Robert, who had been basking in the afterglow of his speech, suddenly looked uneasy. The conversation grew more intense. Mr. Davies leaned in. "So, you're suggesting the company's future might not be as secure as we've been led to believe?" "I'm suggesting," I said, meeting his gaze, "that prudence and transparent strategic planning are paramount. Over-reliance on past successes and an unproven pipeline could be detrimental. My firm, for instance, advises clients to diversify their holdings away from companies with such concentrated risk profiles." That last line hit home. I knew several of these investors were also clients of my bank. The implication was clear. Their investments in the Hayes Company might be in jeopardy, and my bank, and by extension, me, would advise them to pull out. The gala ended with a palpable tension in the air. Richard and Eleanor tried to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. My carefully crafted leak combined with my targeted, informed commentary had sown significant doubt about Robert's leadership and the company's future. The fallout was swift and spectacular. Within days, the initial article about Peyton Cliffs gained traction, and other financial journalists picked up on the story, specifically mentioning the Hayes Company's vulnerabilities. Their stock took a hit, and major investors started asking tough questions. An emergency board meeting was called, and I heard through Mark that it was incredibly contentious. Robert was grilled about his strategic vision and his misleading assurances. Richard, his father, was furious with him for creating such a public relations disaster. The ultimate humiliation came a few weeks later. The board, pressured by investors, decided to pass Robert over for the CEO position. Instead, they appointed an external candidate, a highly respected industry veteran known for strategic foresight and developing robust pipelines. Robert was demoted to a divisional head, a clear demotion from his assumed ascent to the top. Eleanor and Richard were incandescent with rage. They knew I was behind it, even though they couldn't prove anything directly. My concerns had been legitimate, my analysis sound, and the timing impeccable. The public records and industry analysis I presented were all verifiable. Mark's family tried one last desperate maneuver. Eleanor called Mark, hysterically accusing me of destroying Robert's future and disgracing the family. She demanded Mark control his wife and make me apologize. Mark, however, had been privy to all their machinations against me. He had listened to my recordings, seen the baby romper, and felt their constant undermining of our marriage. He unleashed on his mother, telling her exactly what he thought of their despicable behavior, their attempts to sabotage my career, and their suffocating snobbery. He ended the call by telling them that if they couldn't treat me with respect, they wouldn't have him in their lives either. Since then, Mark has gone mostly no contact with his family, limiting interactions to necessary brief calls with his father for logistical matters, but even those are strained. He's been incredibly supportive, validating my feelings and reaffirming his pride in me. He says he finally sees his family for what they truly are, and is done enabling their toxic behavior. My career, meanwhile, has never been better. The board members and investors I spoke with at the gala were impressed by my insight and courage. My firm recognized my strategic brilliance, not just for the merger deal I was working on, but for my astute understanding of market dynamics and corporate vulnerabilities. I've since been promoted to partner, a position I truly earned. It's bittersweet. I never wanted to cause such a rift in Mark's family, but they left me no choice. They tried to break me, to force me into a mold they designed, but instead, I used their own game, their own rules, and their own weaknesses against them. And in the end, I didn't just survive, I thrived. And Mark and I are stronger than ever, free from the suffocating influence of his toxic family. The silence from the Hayes estate is deafening, but to us, it sounds like peace.